live on YouTube. And let me know once it's done.
Done.
Can we begin?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. A very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the Masterclass series on critical agrarian studies. I will hand over the mic to the Dean of the School of Human Ecology, Ambedkar University, Delhi, Dr. Suresh Babu.
Thank you, Buddha. Friends, good evening and a warm welcome to the School of Human Ecology's Masterclass series on critical agrarian studies and to today's theme, water. We are privileged to have with us today Professor Mihir Shah, who really does not need an introduction to an audience on agrarian studies and water. At AUD, we have been fortunate to have benefited from a long association with him. He has been a member of our academic council, and he was also our keynote speaker and chief guest at our 7th annual convocation, in which he spoke on a slightly different thematic on the political radicalism of Ambedkar's spirituality. That was the talk he gave there. And for those of you who are interested to access this talk, this is available online, and the paper is also available online. Professor Shah, thank you very much for agreeing to be here with us today, and a warm welcome. I would also want to thank Professor Meghla Krishnamurthy, who most of you have already met before, who has agreed to be the moderator for this session. Not taking much more time, I request my colleague and the main Sutradhar of this Masterclass series, Professor Asmita Kabra, to formally introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh, and a very warm welcome to this wonderfully diverse global gathering of people to the second masterclass in critical agrarian studies. This series has been curated by myself and Dr. Meghla Krishnamurthy and Dr. Buddhaditya Das. I'd like to begin by saying that at the School of Human Ecology, the focus of critical agrarian studies is on a very particular kind of landscapes and geographies that we have now come to refer to as marginal ecologies. These are grasslands, deserts, drylands, forest frontiers, swidden cultivation areas, and high mountain landscapes, not just in India, but elsewhere too. And this is because we believe that in contemporary times, these landscapes are becoming the focus of very intense debates on development and sustainability. The land and the resources of these areas are of interest to industry on the one hand as potential sites for mining, hydroelectrical projects, solar and wind parks, salt panning, cement plants, special economic zones, and as well as for biodiversity conservation efforts. Caught in the middle of these conflicting pressures are the economically poor and predominantly rural and also increasingly mobile people who inhabit these marginal ecologies. So the everyday lives, livelihoods, situated histories, political struggles, and changing socio-cultural realities of such communities are our focus of agrarian studies at the School of Human Ecology. And in this light, it's such an honor to have with us Professor Mihir Shah. And as Dr. Babu said, for those who are working on water issues in India, he requires absolutely no introduction at all. And nor does the brief time available to me allow me to do any justice to his remarkable contributions to India's public life. One of the most eminent and thoughtful public intellectuals of our time, Dr. Shah straddles with immense ease and humility the often very detached worlds of academia, grassroots action, and policy making. Among his many contributions to the world of policy, I'll only list a few recent ones. From 2009 to 2014, Dr. Mihir Shah was a member of India's Planning Commission, and he was chiefly responsible for drafting the paradigm shift in the management of water resources that was enunciated in the 12th five-year plan. In 2015, the Government of India invited him to chair a committee on restructuring the Central Water Commission and the Central Groundwater Board, and also to chair a committee to draft the National Water Framework Law and the Model Groundwater Sustainable Management Bill. He chaired a task group set up by the government of Karnataka, which drafted a new Karnataka state water policy in December 2018. In November 2019, the government of India invited him to chair the committee to draft India's new national water policy. And I think we will see that very soon in the public domain. Switching to his academic avatar, Dr. Shah is a distinguished professor currently at the Shiv Nadar University, where he has designed a global first of its kind master's program on water science and policy. He, many years ago, he completed a much acclaimed doctoral dissertation at the Center for Development Studies in Kerala. And then he taught at the same center for some years. And personally, for me, his book on India's drylands was an eye-opener when I was working on my own PhD in the Central Indian landscape, because it was one of the rare texts written by an Indian economist, which placed the ecology of the drylands at the center of development planning for the Adivasi inhabitants of these regions. Dr. Shah's journey as a development practitioner dates back to, again, many decades, to when he resigned from the Center for Development Studies to explore the fresh terrain beyond the ivory towers of conventional academia. And this culminated in the year 1990 in the formation of Samaj Pragati Sahyog, or SPS, an organization headquartered in a remote tribal village in central India, and was inspired by the life and work of Baba Amte. So today, SPS is one of India's largest grassroots initiatives for water and livelihood security. And Dr. Shah has spent the last 30 years living and working in some of the most disadvantaged tribal areas of the country, forging a new paradigm of inclusive and sustainable development. Today, I was remembering my own visit to the Samaj Pragati Sahyog offices and field area in 2004, and I can personally vouch for the organization's massive contribution in demonstrating that it is indeed possible to achieve praxis between theory, practice, and policy on the ground and make it work out. I now hand over to today's chairperson and moderator, Dr. Mekhla Krishnamurthy. She was the speaker at our inaugural masterclass, is a fellow conspirator to hatch this series. She's a faculty at the Ashoka University and a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. So over to you, Mekhla, for housekeeping rules, and then on to Dr. Shah's talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Smita. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here this evening. So good evening and good morning, good afternoon, or later evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. So just a few quick housekeeping rules and then we can get started. So this meeting is being recorded for all your information. All audio and video are automatically on mute. Participants who have questions can type their questions on the chat box and I will collect them and sort through them and present them at the end in the Q&A. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can send any questions that you might have to sheconference@aud.ac.in and they will be collected and we'll be able to ask them in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Shah for his talk on water.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mekhla. I'll just share my screen. I hope I can do that without too much ado. Is that visible?
Yes. Yes.
I hope the entire screen is visible. Right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So really for me, it's such a pleasure to be giving this talk, especially organized by Ambedkar University, Delhi, an institution very close to my heart. And as was said earlier, I've had a long association with it. I'm speaking as part of a series of lectures on agrarian studies, and I was asked to talk about water. So that's why the title of the talk that I've chosen, which is in front of you, is Transforming Water for Agriculture and Transforming Agriculture for Water in India. So, you know, it's a two-way relationship between water and agriculture. And the central argument the central argument of my lecture today is stated in the screen in front of you, which is that without a paradigm shift in agriculture, we will not be able to solve India's water problem. And at the same time, without a paradigm shift in water, we will be unable to address India's grave agrarian crisis. So to begin with just a brief look at facts which are largely in the public domain, but it is true that over the last 30 years, more than 300,000 farmers have committed suicides in India. Now, this is something unprecedented in Indian history. You know, you've had agrarian distress, you've had farmers' problems and issues in the long agrarian history of India. But this kind of distress expressed in what I call the two ends of the emotional spectrum. On the one hand, 300,000 farmers or more committing suicide. And on the other hand, young people in the central Indian tribal belt of India taking to the gun, feeling so despondent and so lacking in hope that they believe that the only solution to their problems is through a violent revolution, a violent overthrow of the Indian state. And as I see these two phenomena, they are markers for me of the terrible agrarian crisis that India has been suffering over these last 3 decades, because even the Maoist insurgency is in a sense partly a reflection of the agrarian crisis, because most of these tribal people are actually small and marginal farmers. And so they are also responding to the kind of situation they find themselves in their lives and their livelihoods. If you look at agriculture growth rates, if you look at farmer incomes, in the last few years, we are seeing a very dismal picture indeed. So there is something very serious that is going wrong with Indian agriculture. And I'm here to tell you what that might be and what its connection is with the entire paradigm of agrarian development that India has adopted ever since the Green Revolution. I'm sorry, I'm having a little difficulty in moving the slide, so I seem to go 2 slides forward and 1 slide back, to use a famous phrase from history. So I think what we need to understand very clearly is that the crisis that we are seeing today in Indian agriculture dates back to the onset of the Green Revolution from the 1970s. So it's a 50-year-old crisis building up over time, where chemical agriculture seems to be reaching definitive limits, where farmers are now getting negative marginal returns to the inputs that they are putting into farming, which is that the yield response of output, which is the response of output to the inputs that the farmers are putting in, is declining over time. So in order to get the same level of production, farmers are having to use more and more chemical inputs, fertilizers and pesticides. This has led to a dramatic rise in costs of production and is now yielding negative returns. And if you look at the picture in front of you, you would see, and this is a recent piece of research, and I'll give you the references to all that I'm talking about at the end of the lecture. Now, if you look at this graph carefully, what it shows is that in the purple line, if you see the purple line going up, that is fertilizer consumption expressed in kilograms per hectare. And see how it has, really ballooned up after the 1970s. But then the green line will show you that the productivity of Indian agriculture expressed in kilograms of yield per kilogram of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium fertilizer is actually declining over time. So if you just reflect a little bit on what this graph means, it simply summarizes what I was saying earlier, that the costs of production are going up. And this is only about fertilizers. We can have a similar, I have a lot of data on pesticide use, etc. I'll tell you about the paper in which all of this information is available at the end of the lecture. But we can clearly see the crisis of Indian farming, where what we had banked upon, what we were hoping would lead to the so-called revolution, is actually now creating a major crisis for farmers across the country, with rising cost of production without a corresponding rise in yield, and thereby sort of leading to a situation that many farmers are now drawing negative incomes from farming. This is also, if you look at it carefully, this is also where India's water crisis is coming from. How do we say that? Because the latest FAO Aquastat estimates show that 90% of India's water is used in agriculture. And 80% of this water, this irrigation water, is being taken just by 3 crops. That is rice, wheat, and sugarcane, which are today being grown even in parts of the country which are actually water scarce regions. The reason is simple. The Green Revolution was not so much a green revolution. It was essentially a rice and wheat revolution. And I'll come to that in some detail in a few minutes. So what we did was we incentivized farmers to grow primarily 2 crops, which is rice and wheat, which are highly water consuming crops. And this monocropping, because you primarily, you displaced a situation with great diversity of crops with a cropping pattern which was dominated by a single crop. And as you know, if you grow only 1 crop, then your resilience, your capacity to bear risk, whether it's the weather risk or the market risk, whether it's the risk coming from erratic patterns of rainfall, which are now aggravated by a situation of climate change, or the market risk which any farmer will face, you know that a monocropping system is far more prone to risk than a more diversified portfolio of crops, which would be able to balance the risk. If you did not do well in one, you could do better in the other. This is how traditionally farming had happened in India. But after the Green Revolution, farmers have actually suffered far greater market and weather risks. And that itself is also a major cause for the agrarian crisis in India today. Now, in addition to that, I'm bringing to your notice the fact that water quality is today India's #1 water issue. The excessive fertilizers and pesticides that our farmers are being compelled to use to get higher yields are being transported into our bodies via food and water, and the kinds of varieties of cancers that they are causing, it's been well documented. Cancer today is responsible for about 30 lakh deaths every year in India. And this itself is now, therefore, not just a water crisis, not just a farming crisis, it's also becoming a major health concern in India. So what have we done? What has been the policy response? And what has been the kind of demand even from the community of farmers and farmer activists, that we see across the country? And what I have tried to do in this slide is to summarize the kinds of policy options that have been exercised by farmers, by policymakers, and by farmer organizations. These have been the demands, and these are the actions that have been taken. So what are the steps? Higher subsidies for chemical inputs. In last year's budget speech, the Honorable Finance Minister very, I would say, rightly pointed a new direction for Indian farming, which is to move towards more non-chemical options. But in the same budget, we had an 80,000 crore subsidy for chemical fertilizers. So the demand is that you should keep increasing these subsidies more and more. Or the demand is that we should waive the loans that the farmers have taken from banks. Because farmers are in a crisis, they are unable to pay the loans, so we should go in for loan waivers. Or the demand is that we should have higher minimum support prices for, no prices for guessing, wheat and rice, because wheat and rice are the crops which are being supported by the government. And the demand is for even greater increases in the MSPs for wheat and rice. And finally, the new kid in town, the new flavor of the time is basic income support. So just transfer money to the farmer, keep giving cash to the farmer, and somehow, by waving a magic wand, the agrarian prices will go away. But I'm sorry to say that's not going to happen. Unless we change the paradigm of agriculture in India, we will continue to reinforce the vicious cycle which has created the problem in the first place. If we continue to give subsidies in the direction which are leading to the destruction of Indian agriculture and Indian farmers, we are not going to solve the problem. Loan waivers, if the fundamental nature of agriculture does not change, are not going to make a difference. If you only have higher MSPs for wheat and rice, you are not going to change the cropping pattern in Indian agriculture. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, without doing that, India's water or farm problem cannot be solved. And basic income support, supporting the same farming system, is not going to help any farmer. It's just going to postpone the problem maybe by a few months, because down the line, the farmers are caught in a vicious cycle from which they are not being able to get out, because the same paradigm has been there for the last 50 years and it's not been changed yet. So I'm here to commend to you a paradigm shift in agriculture. Now, the first element of that paradigm shift has to be diversifying the cropping pattern to align with the diverse agroecological conditions found in different parts of the country. The greatest strength of this country is its diversity. Let us not make it our weakness. Let us not enforce monoculture, then create a crisis and then bemoan the diversity of conditions. Rather, let us respect the diversity that we have got, which means there are areas of the country where growing rice and wheat on a large scale makes perfect sense. They are the water abundant areas in the eastern parts of India. But in Punjab and Haryana, in Maharashtra, to grow sugarcane does not make any sense. You cannot continue to grow water intensive crops in areas which have very low rainfall, which are not suited for the growing of water intensive crops, and then hope that by increasing the MSP or giving a loan waiver or giving a cash transfer, you'll be able to solve the problems of farmers. Without alignment of cropping patterns to the agroecology of this country, we will never solve the problem of farmers or the problem of water. The second major element of the paradigm shift has to be that we move away from this heavy chemical input-based farming towards what I call nature-based farming solutions and water-saving techniques. And my proposition here is that this will not only solve the problem of the farmers' incomes, of water security, it will also lead on to river rejuvenation, to an improved soil health, and improvement in the health of consumers. And I'll just want to explain how. So, what we must understand is this is not to blame the farmers for the fact that they have been growing crops like wheat, rice, and sugarcane. The simple fact of the matter is that the incentives that they have been provided, the structure of incentives is such that farmers are growing these crops. And what is that structure of incentives? The market that we agreed. Public procurement operations of the government have focused only, primarily on rice and wheat. 95% of the crops we have procured in the last 50 years since the Food Corporation of India was set up are wheat and rice. And the private sugar factories are purchasing sugarcane. So essentially the market has driven the choice of crops that the farmers have grown. The first step, therefore, to solve India's water and farming problems is to introduce low water requiring, resilient and nutritious millets, pulses and oilseeds into public procurement, which gives you a huge market assurance, which will slowly incentivize the farmers to move towards diversifying their cropping pattern. Now, whenever I make this proposition, the immediate objection is, but what will we do with all the crops that we procure? Where is the demand for these crops? People are not eating, the kinds of nutri-cereals, as they are called, which they were eating before the Green Revolution. Well, my simple answer is, let us introduce these crops. Let us introduce them into the supplementary nutrition program of the ICDS program. Let us introduce them into the midday meal program in our schools and also into the public distribution system. These are the three largest programs of their kind in the world. It's an unimaginable demand that we can create for millets, pulses, and oilseeds, which in fact the farmers will struggle to meet. So the problem is quite the contrary. In fact, you will have so much demand. If you make this simple switch, this switch can be made in every district. Luckily, the midday meal menus are not determined in a centralized manner by governments in the state or national capitals. They are very much in the hands of local administration. If we can make the switch in the menus of these meals, I can tell you we can make a dramatic difference to the crops that the farmers grow, the kind of nutritional profile that the consumers will enjoy, and the water savings that we will effect by making this simple change. We also, of course, need to carry out mass campaigns of popularizing these kinds of nutritional options. Many of us have been engaged in this work in partnership with the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad, and the government of India now has started what they call the Poshan Abhiyan, which is essentially actually moving in this direction. Of course, they are taking baby steps in this direction. We believe that this must be dramatically upscaled so that a diversity of crops is being procured through the public procurement system and becomes available to consumers across the country. As I said, this is also a huge contribution to India's nutrition crisis. So the first reference I wanted the students to look at is an extraordinary report of the Lancet Commission, which was launched in January 2019, called The Global Syndemic of Obesity, Undernutrition, and Climate Change. See, we have, and India typifies this problem, because we have undernutrition and diabetes coexisting. And what we will do if we shift to the nutricerials is to get this extraordinary nutritional input, which is in front of you on the screen. These are the kinds of minerals and vitamins and antioxidants and protein that we'll be able to get if we diversify the kinds of food we eat. And of course, these are the crops which are much more suited to the dryland regions of India, which have been the hotbed of poverty and deprivation, all these years. And these are the crops which will grow much better in 2/3 of India's landmass, so it would help the farmers as well. Now, having made the fundamental proposition about diversifying the cropping pattern, I want to now talk a little bit about the entire conception of the Green Revolution, the foundation, what is the originative flaw of the thinking of the Green Revolution. And here I want to focus your minds on a much neglected subject. We don't understand the significance of soils for the farmer, of soils for water. Because what the Green Revolution did was to view the soil as an input-output machine, as a stockpile of minerals, a passive reservoir of chemical nutrients to be endlessly flogged to deliver greater and greater output. And as we know, our soils are now heavily depleted by this onslaught which has been going on for the last 50 years. We have to recognize that the soil is a complex, interacting, living ecosystem. And unless we nourish this living ecosystem and the plants and animals that feed it, we are not going to be able to either overcome the crisis of agriculture or the crisis of water that this country is facing. Because what matters very much for water security is soil structure, the capacity of the soil to retain water. And that is what we have completely destroyed by our move towards chemical farming in the last 50 years. So we need to move towards exploring alternatives to chemical agriculture, move towards natural farming approaches so that we can reactivate what is called the soil food web, which leverages biological synergies among numerous plant and animal species, from soil fungi to trees, from soil bacteria or worms to livestock. See, the important thing is we need to value the smallest life form, because each of those makes a huge contribution to food and water security on this planet. And the way in which the soil food web operates is an extraordinary wonder to behold. I have put it down on these slides. I was told this is going to be, teaching material. So I've kept it on the slides. But what I really want to show you is this very beautiful picture of how the interconnectedness of different elements of the soil food web is what sustains life on this planet. And we have to very carefully understand that if there is soil, we will exist. If soil is depleted, the way it is being depleted over the last 50 years across the planet, we are actually in very serious trouble already. Students may like to, with time, explore the beauty of this picture, which I think will explain to them what is the way in which life is sustained on this planet without respecting, cherishing, and nurturing the soil food web. We will not be able to solve the problems that we are faced with today. In addition, not only should we grow less water-consuming crops, we must also find solutions for the water-intensive crops. I'm not arguing that we are going to stop either eating or growing wheat, rice, and sugarcane. What I'm saying is that there are options which have been tried and tested on the ground, both by research institutions, civil society organizations, and government organizations, such as systems of crop intensification, drip and sprinkler irrigation, and most importantly, what we have neglected, the propagation of water-saving seed varieties based on the local germplasm. The local germplasm is naturally, over centuries of evolution, adapted to the local agroecology. And India has a very rich repository of these seeds. We must try and build on that repository to solve the problems that we are facing, both, as I said, of farming and of the water crisis. Now, this was a very summary view, because of the shortage of time, of what the changes we require on the farming side are. Now I want to share with you the kind of paradigm shift that is required in water, because there are very many changes that we need in the way the management and governance of water is happening in our country. First, let me draw your attention to groundwater. This is the most neglected part of the water landscape in India. The last 40 years, 84% of our irrigation has come from groundwater. Groundwater meets more than 80% of India's drinking water needs. And it has been the foundation of India's food security, but remains a blind spot in our water resources planning. Today, what has happened is that the resort to deeper and deeper drilling through bore wells and tube wells, which was the magic wand of the Green Revolution, has now become part of the problem itself. 60% of India's districts either suffer from groundwater over-extraction, that is falling water tables, or very serious water quality issues. Now, this is a result of our, again, neglecting the diversity that we are blessed with. We must understand that India has very many types of what are called aquifer formations. Aquifers are the underground storehouses of water. We have 2/3 of India is underlain by what are called hard rock formations. What does it mean? When there is a hard rock formation, when you draw water from below the ground, it takes a very long time for that water to again collect below the ground. If 2/3 of India is hard rock, and we have done very deep drilling of groundwater in these regions of India, it is no surprise that the water table has fallen. And what we have forgotten is that groundwater is a common pool resource. The water below the ground, below, let's say, my farm, actually extends beyond the boundaries of my farm and is shared by the farmers who are also cultivating, alongside me. And we have to recognize that the way we have exploited groundwater through individual atomistic extraction from below the ground is a major reason for the falling of water tables, and is actually also a major reason for the drying up of our rivers and the springs, which have been the sustenance of water in the mountainous regions. Now, in order for you to understand what I'm saying, there are two animations which I'll show you, which have been prepared by my organization, SPS. We have a community media unit which has been doing extraordinary work, making films and audiovisual content which helps understand some of these points better. So I'll let you watch this animation, which explains how a common pool resource like groundwater is destroyed as a result of individualized extraction from below the ground. So this is, you can say, the situation before the Green Revolution, where everybody was taking water from the aquifer through their wells. Then, with bank credit becoming available, some farmers drill deeper. And as you know, water finds its own level. So the tube well has lowered the water table so that the wells which were earlier getting water have run dry. But then begins the mad race for the bottom. More and more farmers drill deeper and deeper for groundwater. And what happens is that as this extraction proceeds apace, slowly, even the farmers who were being able to put in the resources to drill tube wells are getting deprived of groundwater till the day comes when everyone, including the richest farmer, the most resource farmer who had the deepest tube well, all of them have run out of water. This, by the way, is not fiction. This is exactly what has happened in India over the last 30 years, where more and more farmers have faced a situation where their groundwater has been completely exhausted. I will now show you the next animation, which will illustrate how the over-extraction of groundwater has led to the drying up of India's rivers. So here is the situation, the original situation, if you like, before the Green Revolution, where there is a river and there is an aquifer. And this is a river, see, after the monsoon is over, after the monsoon rain is over, India's rivers get their water from the base flows of groundwater. That was the original situation that you saw in this animation. But as farmers drill deeper and deeper into the aquifer, the gaining river has become a losing river. What happens at the end? The river has dried up, and so has the aquifer. So both the river and the groundwater are actually finished. And this, again, let me tell you, is not something which I have just invented through this animation. This is what has happened in river after river across the length and breadth of India. And this is a latest study of 55 catchments of the major rivers of this country, which shows, and the rivers are mentioned in this slide in front of you, there has been a major decline in the annual runoff generated by India's major river basins. And mind you, the study is very careful. This has not happened because of a decline in rainfall. This has happened because of economic activities destructive of the catchment areas of these rivers. What are the catchment areas? The areas from which a river catches its water. If you over-extract the groundwater, if you destroy the natural flows of water, if you deforest the catchment areas, then this is what tends to happen to our rivers. If our river basins survive, we also will. Otherwise, like many great river valley civilizations of the past, we too will perish. So there is something we must learn from the experience of our river systems over the last 50 years. Otherwise, we are facing a major crisis as a civilizational entity. Having seen the kinds of problems that the water crisis that we have, let us just quickly review what we have done to try and solve these problems. As you know, the major intervention we have made is to build large dam structures across our river systems. The latest estimate is that we have spent 400,000 crores in building major and medium irrigation projects since independence. But what is deeply tragic is not just the displacement of our tribal people, the submergence of fertile land and forests, but the greatest tragedy is that the reason why these dams were built, that reason itself is not being satisfied. The trillions of liters of water stored in these large dam structures are not reaching the farmers for whom this water was meant. Maharashtra is the biggest example. It has the highest number of large dams in the country. 40% of India's large dams are in Maharashtra. But it has half of the irrigated area. That is the ratio of irrigated area to agriculture area, which is around 40-45% across the country, is only 18% in Maharashtra. Reason is simple. What we have done is we have focused on more and more construction. We have not focused enough on getting that water for the farmers for whom it is meant. So where do the solutions lie? The solution lies in shifting the focus from endless construction to management, maintenance, and last mile connectivity. This is based on the best experience from across India and across the world. Participatory irrigation management, where you involve the people, and especially water users associations led by women. When you hand over the last mile connectivity, the minor structures and the field channels to farmers, then we find that we can add millions of hectares to irrigated area at much lower cost. The latest estimate is actually 24 million hectares can be added to India's irrigated area without even building a single new large dam, by making irrigation management participatory in nature. And these are the kinds of, it's a summary of the benefits of PIM, as it's called. You don't have to acquire land, you don't have to do resettlement and rehabilitation, no major construction is involved. And I'm sorry, irrigation has been a major hub of corruption in this country. There is no contractor, politician, official nexus. There is no cost escalation. You know, the last time we did this estimate for escalation, that is the original cost of a dam and what it finally is when it's completed, it was 1,382%. You know, to be honest, I can't even think immediately of what that figure exactly means, but it means that you're spending far more than what you had actually, allotted for building that dam. And that is why you are constantly getting more and more delays in the construction of these projects. And you are getting what is called the IPC-IPU gap, which means there is a major gap between the irrigation potential that you created by building these dams and the actual water that reached the farmers. That is what is called the irrigation potential utilized, which I said is today 24 million hectares. We can get those 24 million hectares quickly to the farmers. For that, democratization of water is required. We need to move towards participatory irrigation management. Similarly, we need to move towards participatory groundwater management. You know, when people hear of groundwater being overexploited, the first instinct is, there should be a law, we should prevent these people from doing this, we should send inspectors. But the fact is, we have 45 million groundwater structures in India, which means wells, tube wells, and there are another 5 million springs which are providing groundwater to this country, which includes even urban groundwater. Now, can you imagine if we tried to send inspectors to try and control the overexploitation of groundwater? It would just spawn a new industry of corruption. But there is a very simple way forward, which has been blazed. The trail has been blazed by farmers, more than 1 million farmers in Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Sikkim, and Kutch. Some of this work I have had personal experience in doing. And this is based on informing the farmers, informing the primary stakeholders of the aquifer characteristics. How much water is there? If you have the following cropping pattern, how many years will this groundwater last? If you change the cropping pattern towards less water consuming crops, you can actually probably use this groundwater in perpetuity. So once farmers understand in simple terms what is the nature of the aquifers from which they are drawing the groundwater, they are able to change their cropping pattern, what is called, they can do crop water budgeting. The primary point I'm making is that we must move away from supply-oriented solutions. We keep thinking that we can endlessly increase the supply of water, but we have not focused on the demand side. We have to see that if we continue the pattern of demand as it has been going, we will soon completely run out of water. So crop water budgeting becomes a very important part of how you can manage groundwater both sustainably and equitably. So we must move towards participatory groundwater management in this country. We also have to really seriously think about river rejuvenation. You know, people talk of the incredible medicinal properties of the Ganga. Now, some people dismiss this as superstition. Others devoutly believe in it. The fact is, scientific studies have been done, and the water of the Ganga in its pristine form does have medicinal value. And guess where that medicinal value comes from? It comes from the Himalayan catchment areas, the kinds of grasses, shrubs, and trees that grow in the Himalayan catchments where the Ganga derives its water. They are the ones which provide the water of the Ganga with so much medicinal value. If you destroy the catchment areas, if you do not nurture Himalayan ecology, the Ganga is no longer going to have the kind of pristine value it had. This has been recognized all over the world. You know, sometimes when I give this kind of example, the youngsters say, oh, you're talking this old world stuff. But let me tell you, in a city like New York, which many people admire, you would be happy to know, or you may be surprised to know, that the city of New York worked for decades with the people living in the catchment areas of New York to try and persuade them to nurture the catchment areas so that New York could get pristine water of the highest quality. And in order that the farmers agreed to that proposition, they were paid. A payment was made for the ecosystem services provided by those farmers so that the citizens of New York could get good quality water. And this is now being replicated across the world. I mentioned the countries on this slide. We need to urgently move towards a situation where farmers are incentivized through the payment of ecosystem services, a compensation for the ecosystem services they provide by maintaining the catchment areas in a healthy state. Finally, we need to look at water governance. See, what we have done in India is to look at water. The term is hydroschizophrenia. What does it mean? It's like we have a schizophrenic view of water. We look at irrigation separately, drinking water separately. We look at surface water separately, groundwater separately. We look at water separately and wastewater separately. What does that do? When you do not look at them in an integrated manner, the same well or tube well which was supplying drinking water to a settlement starts drawing water for irrigation. And irrigation consumes much more water than drinking water. So after a few years, that well or bore well runs dry. So the security of drinking water is endangered, primarily because we have not planned for both needs together. As I already explained, if you don't look at surface water and groundwater together, our rivers start drying up. If you don't look at water and wastewater together, the quality of water declines and creates very serious health concerns. We have a mixing of water and wastewater that keeps happening throughout the water cycle, and that becomes a very serious problem. So we have to reform water governance in India by overcoming this hydroschizophrenia. The next change in water governance that we require is that water governance in India has been dominated only by a few academic disciplines, primarily civil engineering and hydrogeology, which is the science of groundwater. But if you really want people to get involved, if you want participatory management of groundwater and surface water, if you want conflict resolution, we have to involve professionals from the social sciences and management. If you want crop water budgeting, which we spoke about, you have to involve agronomists. Did you know that not a single water resource department, either at the center or the states in India, has anyone from the social sciences or management, anyone from agronomy, anyone from ecological economics, or anyone from river ecology? Without having professionals from all these disciplines, you will never be able to either understand water or make water policy and water strategy effectively in this country. We have to change the pattern of governance in this country to make it truly multidisciplinary so that all the insights from all these disciplines are brought to bear on the management and governance of water in this country. So what we are proposing, and I'll tell you the references where all this has been suggested, we have the Central Water Commission, the CWC, which manages surface water in India. We have the Central Groundwater Board, which manages groundwater in India. And every state has similar departments which manage surface and groundwater separately. We have suggested that we need to merge the CWC and the CGWB to form the National Water Commission as the apex facilitation body for water policy, data, and governance in India. And this exercise of the center should become an exemplar that all states follow to overcome the silos inherent in their own governance structures in water. And what we are saying is, rather than sitting in Delhi or in the state capitals, these professionals should now move to the major river basins of this country so that actual water management and governance can begin to happen. And finally, we are appealing to the government that water is too important to be left to the government alone. We need what is called a Jan Andolan, a people's movement around water, led by women, through an appropriately managed architecture of partnerships with all primary stakeholders from civil society, academia, farmers, elected representatives, and industry. Their knowledge and expertise, their experience has to be mobilized. They must form an integral part of the National Water Commission and the state water commissions that all states must design, curate, and implement, without which I believe that India's water problems cannot be solved and India's agrarian crisis cannot be overcome. This is what I wanted to tell you. These are the references. If you want, I can just quickly summarize them. The first reference is from a paper which is forthcoming. I've just completed writing this paper for the FAO and the Niti Aayog, which actually the entire argument of this paper, of this presentation, is summarized in this paper. The slide, where you saw that graph with two arrows going in opposite directions, which showed that fertilizers response has been declining. This is the reference for that. And of course, all the governance reform comes from a committee which I chaired for the Government of India, which is called the Report for the Report of the Committee on the Restructuring of the CWC and CGWB. And the lovely diagram on the soil food web comes from this USDA reference, and students may like to look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mihir, because I think what you gave us was such a complex story that is both the interconnectedness of how we need to think and approach water, agriculture, and both the agrarian crisis and the water crisis, and with a great deal of urgency. The need to think differently about how we approach these problems at multiple levels. So thank you so much for that. There are a number of questions coming in, which I will, come in on. And they're all sort of linked to the political economy and some specific questions around agriculture. But because this is a masterclass and it's also about sort of, thinking about how various scholars have come to think about water, I thought if you could briefly I'm going to take the privilege of being the chair, but briefly give us a sense of, how you first encountered water in your intellectual and professionally. Sort of, I know, as an economist in your early work on agrarian India, where water starts becoming for you central to how you think about this, sort of that journey, just a little bit for us to think about. And then texts that early, either missed water, that surprised you that it wasn't there. Like, water has this funny way of being everywhere and still being missed in so much of how we think about agrarian India. So, because you also arrived at water through so many different pathways in your talk, just that little reflection, and then I will turn to all these questions which are, sort of coming in.
You have asked a very dangerous question, because if I start telling the story, it could become very long. But to very simply say, Asmita already said that I was I completed my PhD. I was teaching at the Center for Development Studies. And then a group of friends, all of us just decided that we've had enough of academia. We felt that there was a lot of talk, but not enough was done. And we were very angry young people, not happy at the state of the nation. And so we set out on this journey, which was slightly wild and crazy. And we had no idea what we were doing. But we were traveling across the length and breadth of India, which led, to cut a long story short, to the formation of what we call Samaj Prakriti Sahyog, which was founded in 1990. And this was, we located ourselves very consciously in one of the most neglected and remote areas of this country, which was a tribal area, which is where I'm sitting actually today and speaking to you, which is my home of the last 30 years, where we felt this region typified the most difficult problems India was facing. And when we spoke to the people in this region, because we came here as students, we came here to understand from the people, what they felt we could be useful at, what we should be doing. And the one resounding unanimous answer, especially from women, was that we should focus on water. Because if there is water, there is life, there is livelihoods. Without that, nothing else would be possible. We had been studying around ecology. We had, been understanding the issues that come up from India's development model and how we had neglected the understanding of the interface between economy and ecology. And that was already bringing us, to understand the centrality of water issues. So we began from there trying to implement watershed programs in, partnership with the local people. What I talked about, the rehabilitation of catchment areas, rejuvenation of catchment areas, this is where we learned everything from. We learned that instead of trying to dominate nature, which had been the dominant paradigm of development, which continues to be the dominant paradigm of development today in this country, across the world, we have to actually weave our interventions into the contours of nature with humility, with the recognition of interdependence, of different elements that characterize the cycles of nature. And the current pandemic, if it has done anything, it has brought us back to a realization that if we do not pay urgent attention to redefining our relationship with nature, with water, we are going to keep encountering more and more crises of the current kind. So, it's from then to now, it's the affirmation of the same learning that we need to be humble instead of being arrogant and dominant in our relationship with nature. We have to learn from nature. We have to make interventions, but they have to be interventions which actually respect the natural cycles, as I explained, with reference to farming systems, with soil structure, and with the cycles of water.
Okay. Thanks so much. So there are a number of questions coming in. I'll try and pull them together a little bit so that, so the first, actually, so related to fertilizers. So Rahul had this question about the fact that, the graph that you showed, he was not able to see how productivity went up with fertilizer use. So the question is, was there a sustained period of productivity gain from fertilizer use or not? Because he wasn't able to see that in the graph. And so that's a clarification. And then sort of linked to that, then a question, connected to fertilizer use, which is, to talk a little more about natural farming techniques that you would recommend. And this is Riya Sharma, who's a graduate student in cultural anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So, so linked to fertilizers, does that include standardized protocols of organic farming, individual experiments in permaculture, or a more flexible approach where farmers rely on their own expertise and traditional knowledge? So that's a fertilizer natural farming. Okay. You could take that first.
So I think that's a good spot by Rahul about the graph, because in fact, I've been also wondering, this is not my own graph, I've given the reference for that. But I think what it reflects is the average situation in the country. There were regions where productivity was going up, but it's also true that we indiscriminately applied this, method of farming to areas where it was probably not suited. So what it shows actually is the indiscriminate application and increase in application of fertilizers. So what you find is the yield per unit of fertilizer on an average actually starts declining very early, which is a very striking, finding in this graph. And it keeps getting aggravated over time. It gets aggravated because the application of fertilizers is, increasing exponentially, while you don't see a corresponding increase in fertility, in productivity, in actually most parts of the country. So it's a very interesting, situation where today, even today, everywhere the main thing that a chief minister wants to do is to get urea through trains and other ways to the farmers. The farmers also don't see any options. So I think the second question, quickly, connects to the first, that we need to provide a menu of options to our farmers. And let me be very clear, there should be no fundamentalism here. The tragedy in Andhra Pradesh to begin with was that the fundamentalism of the Green Revolution was being replaced by the fundamentalism of what was called zero budget natural farming. Now, let me make it very clear, whatever, with some good fortune, I have been engaged in farming for the last 30 years. There is no farming which is zero budget. So let's be very clear about that. I'm glad that the government of Andhra Pradesh now has withdrawn the word zero budget under pressure from a lot of us who very strongly believe in the option that they are trying to create. But the fundamentalism we have to reject. So I think India, as I said, is a land of great diversity. And that diversity must be matched by the diversity in our approaches as well. So, the slogan that we are adopting today is, let 100 flowers bloom. Let there be different approaches depending on the different agroecologies of this country. Already, there are many well-established practices, such as non-pesticide managed agriculture, low external input sustainable agriculture, biodynamic agriculture, conservation agriculture. All of these, I think, are extraordinary efforts, but all of them are today at a very small scale. And what we are therefore pushing the government at the center and in the states is to change their policy vis-a-vis farming by shifting the structure of subsidies. I mentioned the 80,000 crores given to chemical fertilizers, but what subsidies are we providing for organic manure? I don't believe that we don't need organic manure. That's my view. If some natural farmers don't agree with that. The point is, these disagreements, let them flower. Let us all, in fact, I believe that we should study each of these experiments. So, we are now putting into place protocols for the evaluation of different forms of natural farming, if you like, where we understand the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, which is what we didn't do with the Green Revolution. It was one size fits all. So what we must understand is the availability of inputs that the non-chemical farming requires is a very serious problem today, is a very serious constraint in forging alternatives to chemical farming. We have to, the government has to, and I would say, again, women-led self-help groups. This can be a great livelihood option. We can set up large-scale units for the manufacture of organic inputs, which include not just fertilizers. It includes, the kinds of, the way in which we are managing pests. See, these are not pesticides. Let's be clear. Chemical farming kills pests. Our farming, if I may call it that, actually harnesses the power of the natural cycle that exists in nature, and so is based on things like pest repellents. So you use very interesting mixtures of leaves found in the forest, of the products like neem, of things like cow's urine, which people have a great sort of some kind of liberal allergy to. But I think these are very important ingredients because they have been tested and tried on the ground for the last 30 years. It's not a fiction that has been perpetuated, but there are strong lobbies opposing this. The fertilizer and pesticide lobbies are very strong in India, across the world, and it's a big battle that we have to fight. Just like in water, we are fighting a big battle to reform water. We have to fight this big battle to reform farming. So the most important thing we can do to fight that battle is to actually set up proofs of concept at scale. So a lot of state governments, not just Andhra Pradesh, are now moving in this direction. The Niti Aayog has taken a very strong position in favor of natural farming. What we are saying is, let the pattern of subsidies also reflect this emphasis on natural farming. Today, that's not happened yet, but I'm hopeful that it could happen in a very short time to come.
Thanks. So, Mihir, I think you've moved very much into the direction in which the questions are coming in. Many thanks. I think lots of people are expressing their thanks for a very, very insightful and illuminating class. But now I think the questions are pushing a little at the political economy that you mentioned, right? The interests that go against making all of this happen, even though we have now quite a profound understanding of the urgency and the requirement. So there are a cluster of questions. Anjali has asked, do you think that the political interest will ever get aligned with your view of sowing millets over cash crops, particularly, in the case of Punjab and Haryana, so how we incentivize farmers to sow something other than cash crops, right? And will that create disturbances for farmers? There's a linked question here saying that, there have been examples, this is from there have been examples of upper caste capturing water resources within participatory irrigation management systems. So how can participatory irrigation management overcome such elite capture? Then there's a question on groundwater markets. So then is the answer, can the evolved groundwater markets be called the solution? So where you actually do demand management, and is that a better institutional mechanism? This is from Shrishti Mishra. Or can they be tagged as just another governance fallacy? So, these are all questions, I think, that look at the challenges, the political economy challenges in three cases. And then these different models have their own challenges. So maybe you could take those.
See, I think there is what Michael Lipton would have called an urban bias in some of these questions. That we feel that the farmers of Punjab are somehow very fond of rice and wheat. And, even now the agitations are going on and the farmers across the country don't want to shift. I mean, I would recommend to the students to read Asian Drama by Gunnar Myrdal. He was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. I don't know if anybody teaches Myrdal anymore. Asian Drama is an extraordinary text. And if you read Asian Drama, he describes the story of India's Green Revolution and how farmers resisted tooth and nail, moving to the varieties of wheat that were being almost forced down their throat, if I may use that phrase, of course, in the great national interest, larger national interests, etc., because farmers did not like the kind of roti that was being made from that kind of flour. They did not like the kind of dalia that was coming out of those varieties which were being pushed to the Green Revolution, and the whole set of practices that were being recommended by the scientists and the agricultural extension system. So I think we must realize that choices on the ground reflect the kind of structures of facilitation that the state puts into place. And what I'm saying is, if you put in place a similar structure of facilitation, of incentives that you did at the time of the Green Revolution, I mean, it worked for the first 20 years. One should not take away from that. I think food security was a major problem, major challenge, and I think the Green Revolution helped address that. But for the last at least 20 years, the wheels have come off the Green Revolution, and today the farmers actually are crying out for an alternative, which we are not providing. And what I'm saying, therefore, is if you change the structure of incentives by diversifying the portfolio of procurement, maybe, I didn't spend enough time on that slide as I should have. But what I'm saying is farmers grow rice and wheat today because those are the crops we have incentivized them. Those are the crops. See, MSPs are there for all crops. But where does procurement focus? Procurement only focuses on these two crops across the country. We don't even procure, for heaven's sake, from the tribal areas of this country. Why can't the government move into the tribal areas to say, look, you grow your traditional crops, you grow the crops which are suited to your agroecology, and we are there as people working in the interest of the farmers to actually procure those crops. Now, what is the political incentive to do that? The political incentive is 3 lakh farmers' suicides. I mean, is that not incentive enough? It's the farmers' agitation. Is that not incentive enough? Don't we need to respond to what the farmers are crying out for change? I think there is an outcry from the ground, both in terms of the farmers' crisis and the water crisis. Let me repeat once again, there cannot be a solution to India's water problem if we do not change the cropping pattern in this country. You can call me a cropping pattern fundamentalist on water. I'll be happy to be called that. Because 90% of India's water is being taken by farming. And as I said, that is being guzzled by 3 water-intensive crops. So if we want to release water for the large mass of small and marginal farmers, if we want to release water for drinking water security, for the Jal Jeevan mission, which at large expense is being taken up by the government of India, if we want to release water for urban areas and industrial use, we have to change the pattern of water use in this country. And the first change that we need to make is in the cropping pattern. And again, let's not blame the farmer. Let's not blame the consumer. It is we who have pushed for certain crops, and those are the crops which are being grown. Those are the crops being procured. Those are the foods being eaten. We need to change all of this by changing the structure of policy in our country. So, I can go on about that because that's my major theme. But let me come to the question of elite capture. Always the question that is asked, whenever somebody speaks about participatory approaches in India, the simple answer given by those who are against these approaches and who want to continue with the command and control which has been going on, and also those who understand ground realities, the question is, what will we do about the caste system? My point is, when India became independent, do you know that there was such deep skepticism that in a country with such class and caste divides, will democracy ever work? When Panchayati Raj was coming into this country, what is the question asked? There will be elite capture. Of course, there will be elite capture. But what is the answer to elite capture? Democracy and more democracy is the only answer to elite capture. We have to allow the democratic process to work itself out. We have to allow people's struggles for the assertion of the voice of the disadvantaged and deprived to express itself through democratic means. Because if we don't do that, then what I mentioned earlier, the Maoist insurgency is waiting around the corner. So let's be clear. There is elite capture. There is a caste system. There is great inequality, social and economic in this country, interregional inequality. And it is an important barrier to universal access to basic services in this country. But the only answer to that is to push forward through greater participatory approaches in all aspects, actually in all services that are being to be reached to the people. But let's also understand there are many these successful experiments of participatory approaches have been studied very carefully. It begins with the classic work which all students must read at one time or the other in their life. That is Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons. Okay, what is the book about? It's about documenting how the commons can be managed through a participatory approach. And it outlines very, very definite conditions under which and only under which participatory approaches will work. So let's not romanticize participation, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's extremely important to understand the conditions and make them available. And it's not patronage that will make them available. It's voices from the ground. It's the pressure from the ground which makes reform happen, which makes change happen. And I would appeal to all the young people listening to this lecture. It's up to you to go out there and mobilize people, whether in rural areas, whether in urban areas, to actually voice these issues. Let issues like water and the farmers' crisis become the issues on which elections are fought and lost in this country. Let's move towards that future, and that is when participatory approaches will show their real power.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Mihir and Asmita has just reminded everybody that the next session is actually on democracy, which is so important. And so it really, sets us up to think about this there. Okay, so now there are a whole range of other questions that are pouring in, and I'm again going to try and sort them out. There's a question about tobacco being a particular commodity that it actually is quite good in terms of employing people and for dry lands, but it has other sides to it. And also about oil palm and being suggested now for the Northeast. And so there's specific questions around the pros and cons of thinking about commodities that actually may be less water guzzling, but have other challenges. And along with that, actually, Rashmi Singh, who is a PhD scholar at the School of Human Ecology, asks about the connectedness of agricultural, water, and animal husbandry policies. So I think this is an important question, thinking about policy flaws. She says, in the livestock policies have also resulted in changes faced in terms of animal rearing across the Himalayas as well as the plains, and animals are indeed the critical source of natural manure. Also the associated knowledge systems and how they're fading with time, development, and the changing aspirations. That links to a series of questions that have been asked around knowledge and around science and policy. And also,
then we could, because that's a huge area in itself.
Yeah.
No, I think, look, tobacco. I mean, look, that's why I was speaking about, it's not just about water. You know, what I was talking about is about health, it's about nutrition. And therefore, I was emphasizing crop diversification in this direction because it has great implications for health and positive implications for health. So tobacco, I mean, you know, there can be crops which are good in terms of their water consumption, but the kind of negative impact they have on human health, I think, therefore, I have not mentioned it and I would not. Oil palm. I mean, this is really something which drives me crazy, actually, because India has the richest repository of oil seeds, you know, that the world has ever seen. And, you know, this paper that I have put in your reading list, and you will read this paper when it becomes available early next year. What we have done, my colleague Vijay Shankar, who's really the leading expert in this country on these issues, we studied the cropping pattern before the onset of the Green Revolution in major states of this country. And what we found is this extraordinarily rich, range of oil seeds that this country was growing. And then, you know, we in Madhya Pradesh, we are talking only of soybean, but we have had so many kinds of oilseeds which were a major critical part of our diet and a very important, nutritionally important part of our diet. We have forgotten about all that. We have forgotten that we have so many options as far as, you know, oil is concerned, and we need to focus on those rather than going for, see, this is monoculture again. I am making an argument against monoculture, whether it's a monoculture of oil palms or of eucalyptus or of the, you know, to come to the livestock question of the Jersey cow or of the tube well or of rice and wheat. So the question about livestock is extremely important because we have had again the same kind of monoculture in livestock. We have just focused. So what is the point about the Green Revolution I didn't mention? It's essentially commodity centric. It's commodity production centric. This is how the international system on agricultural research, the CGIAR, their whole focus, the whole thrust was to do research on increasing output, the response of output to input, but did not look at the system, did not take a systems approach. And the same thing we have done in livestock, increase milk production, as if that's the be-all and end-all of life, while what we need, especially for the landless people in this country, is going back to the kinds of livestock that has sustained people in the drylands, the desert regions of this country, the pastoralists, you know, the kind of backyard poultry you had. Now you have this broiler industry with disastrous health implications just because you get a somewhat greater output. But the kinds of diseases, again, you know, remember the pandemic. Remember what happened, when we have violated so deeply into nature. The same dangers exist in going into that direction with livestock. I think we must understand the link between economy and ecology. If we do not always remain cognizant of the relationship between economy and ecology, we will continue to make mistakes in our drive for endless profit without recognizing the issues of sustainability and equity, which are absolutely central and which have come home to us through the pandemic. Great. And so that ties to your question on knowledge. So
yes, so I will lead right in there. We have about, we had scheduled time till about 6:30, so that's about 10 more minutes. There are lots of questions, and I'm sure people would be happy to stay on a little longer if you have a little more time.
Yeah, sure.
But we'll go through some of these, and so knowledge is a theme that has emerged in a number of questions. So Amit says, thank you for this very informative talk, and this so there's this question about decentralized government systems, and that common people have much less contribution in policy making and policy implementation. And so would like to try and understand also about the complexity and difference between scientific knowledge and indigenous traditional knowledge when it comes to water-related policy making. And linked to that, and I think is a really interesting question, which is, he says, in many parts of rural India, despite the fact that water is contaminated, people use the water to drink and for other household purposes. And even if the state is supporting them to change. So thinking methodologically and as a scholar, what can one say and how can one understand how people perceive water quality? So this is about people's perceptions of water quality. I'll just list a number of questions around the same theme of science, policy, indigenous knowledge. So Suraj, again, thanks very much for the lecture, and then says, if we have three facets of the crisis, a scarcity, ignorance of agroecologies, and technological shifts, how is it even possible to think about bringing science and policy together? This is with respect to the concern that the development plans, when coupled with security, are even more dangerous. So if technical interventions are themselves misaligned and misinformed, plus then they're incentivized, how does one think about the local institutional level? Linked again to that, there's one other question, which is around, have we lost generations of knowledge already? Did we lose, and this is Shaina Sehgal, who thanks you for the breathtaking scope of your masterclass, and says, did we lose generations of integrated agricultural knowledge, including crop patterns, cultivars, water use, when the Green Revolution deprivileged it? And what do we do, in terms of the future? And then finally, linked to this, but sort of slightly broadening, Asmita asked whether you might want to speak about the cultural and spiritual affinity that we humans have to rivers and other water bodies, and whether and how this can be tapped into for better water conservation. Especially for urban residents who are far removed from the elemental nature of water in our everyday lives. So I think there's a whole complex of questions around science, water, spirituality, knowledge, policy.
So yeah, this is really what I'm most passionate about. So let me dive straight away into it. I think I'm going to actually begin with where Asmita left off and then connect it to the other questions. So I think it's very important to ask the question, what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes science, actually? Because as I have understood science, see, we are all being schooled in a certain tradition of science, which dates back about 300 years. But what we forget sometimes is that there is actually science which exists in every civilization, and in some for at least the last 3,000 years. So we have available for us resources if we choose to look at them. And I think in the context of the pandemic again, and I keep coming back to that, and the context of climate change, I think these are huge wake-up calls for humanity to reflect very deeply on whether, the science of the last 300 years has been invaluable. It has, made such a huge contribution to human well-being. So we should not take away from that. But I think we need to interrogate also whether there is something in that paradigm which has also led us into making very, very serious mistakes, civilizational mistakes, if I may call them that. And then if we can try and see what this so-called indigenous knowledge has to teach us, I don't think it's lost forever. I'm sure a lot of it, needs to be regenerated, to be rejuvenated. There are people, I've had the good fortune of living and working among them for the last 30 years. So all my understanding is derived from the Adivasi people with whom I have worked. And I think there is huge knowledge if we choose to pay respect to it. And that knowledge tells us about a different relationship with nature. And that, incidentally, is pure science. So, sometimes we speak of science versus tradition, modern versus pre-modern. The fact is, I'm not very sure how useful the hierarchy that we set up between these modes of knowledge is. In my current explorations, I am tending to become a bit more biased towards this ancient knowledge. But you should correct for my bias in that direction. But let me tell you with all the force at my command that there is a lot that we can gain from these knowledge systems, which are based on thousands of years of experience. See, what is scientific practice? It is the practice of finding solutions to problems. And there are enormous solutions that are available in these traditions, which we must seriously engage with. I feel there has to be a very serious dialogue between the scientific establishments of the world, which are today in danger of becoming vested interests. I mean, I'm making a strong statement. I'm not talking of all scientists. I know there are extraordinary scientists, because there are scientists who respect the spirit of science. The spirit of science is the spirit of discovery. It's the retention of the sense of wonder that a child has when she looks at the universe. That sense of wonder is what, for me, defines the spirit of science. And that's the only spirit I'm trying to defend here. So I'm saying, if we lose that sense of wonder, that sense of being a student all our lives, we will fall prey to the vested interests, who are obviously interested in pushing for certain solutions, because there are commercial interests tied to that. There is a lot of profit to be made in the fertilizer and pesticide industries of the world. And therefore, there is a vested interest in not allowing other alternatives to come up, which could, as they see it, endanger the possibilities of the continued expansion of these kinds of input producing industries, and which is all linked to the fossil fuel economy. I mean, it is all linked to climate change. If we are scientists, if we are listening to the voice of science, if we are understanding that we are in the age of the Anthropocene, we have to pose a question to the dominant paradigms of development of the 20th century. The 20th century will be remembered as the century of technological advance, but also of the enormous growth in the capacity for technological destruction. And if we don't understand that, we are being unscientific. That's all I'm saying. So given that the destruction is in front of us, the 20th century is a testament to that, we need to learn and we need to understand. I didn't cover many other things in the lecture, for solutions in water, wastewater treatment through bioremediation. These are nature-based solutions. Blue-green infrastructure. The entire world is moving towards that. The major cities in the world are now preparing for climate change, and they are saying, let's preserve and protect the green areas in our cities. Let's make our cities sponge cities. Let's preserve the water bodies that already exist. This is the science I'm talking about. In fact, the leading scholar on water in the world is David Sedlak at the University of Berkeley. And he's saying that we have the opportunity to leapfrog the technologies of the 20th century. The vast areas of India which have not made the mistakes that our metros have made, which have gone for the capital and energy intensive solutions of the 20th century. They can leapfrog into the 21st century solutions, which are based on a partnership with nature. So I think that's science. That's absolutely 21st century science. So let's never get confused that there is a dilemma about whether we are for science or against science. We are for science. But we have to move with science where it is taking us. And if we do not understand that, then we are falling prey to the vested interests, the lobbies who are trying to suppress the voice of real science as it is emerging in the 21st century.
Thank you, Mihir. I think the scope and the scale of this, the talk and all the connections just keep growing. But let me try and bring it to an end with two questions. I think you've addressed, many participants have had questions around public organization, sort of correcting the power balance, democratization, and you answered many of this already in your statements on democracy and voice. So let me end with two quite challenging questions. One is, from Bhupendra Kumar, who sort of says that, in your proposition of democratization of irrigation, you sort of propose that participatory irrigation. So do you think that participatory irrigation method is a pragmatic way to deal with unequal power? Or do you think that rich farmers should pay to marginal farmers, right? Like, why is the claim that the first world should pay to the third world for the damage that has been done? So this is a question on reparations in some senses. And what do you think about that when we think about something like water as a resource? So that's on people and power. And then Vinay, who's a student at the International Institute of Social Studies at The Hague, says lots of the change has to do with tinkering with the state. Right? Change is relied on state planning, which has caused the problem in the first place. So how do you look at the state, and how can the status quo exist, that exists there? How can that be changed? Who is the agent of change here? And how does the struggle with power look when you think about state, society, and market? So I think these are the big questions: reparations for damage over time, and how do you look at the state when it comes to thinking about water?
No, truly excellent questions, and thank you. They really are I must thank you for the amazing moderation you did today. These are really good questions to end with. So, I'm going to catch, I forgot who asked the first question, but the word pragmatic. So are reparations pragmatic? I mean, I wish we could have reparations from the first world to the third and fourth world. I live in the fourth world, as you know. And if we could have it from the rich farmers to the poor farmers. So actually, all my life has been spent in trying to devise solutions which actually work. I don't use the word pragmatic. It's got connotations which I don't always like. So when you talk of participatory irrigation management, I understand where the skepticism is coming from. India is a very hierarchical society. There are structures of power, and participatory approaches are definitely disadvantaged to begin with. But as I already said in my answer earlier, I think what we need to do is to strengthen these participatory approaches. We need to make it possible for them to succeed. So to go into some more detail, and incidentally, these approaches have succeeded. So everything that I've said in my talk today is based on established proofs of concept on the ground. They are not theoretical solutions. All of the points I've made in this lecture have been tried. I'm saying they need to be taken to scale. And one of the key things in PIM, in participatory irrigation management, is the retention of the irrigation service fees. Look, let's not, beat about the bush. There is a very established vested interest which is not allowing irrigation to be reformed in India. These are the vested interests who I mentioned in my slide on PIM, who have made money out of large irrigation projects. But there is pressure from the ground. And this connects with the second question which was asked. There is pressure from the ground now for change to happen because there is a serious water crisis and people want alternative approaches. And these have been tried by many state governments. So what they've done is to empower the water users associations. They have empowered the participation of women. They have made it legally mandatory for that to happen. They have made it legally mandatory for the irrigation department to let the water users association retain a lion's share of what is called the irrigation service fees. What does that do? That gives the farmers the resources to be able to manage the systems, the O&M costs of those systems, the construction costs of the last mile connectivity which irrigation requires. All of these are managed and paid for by the farmers themselves. That becomes possible only if there is an enabling state. So let me go into the second question which was asked, which is about how do I look at the state? And I think my entire lecture was really about that. It's about the fact that a state in a democratic society needs to find legitimacy for its existence. Any government has to legitimize its rule in the eyes of the people that vote for it. And the pressure, the legitimation pressure that is exercised upon any government is what gives us that space within which we can try and push policies in the direction of those who have been excluded, who have not had a voice for decades to come. That is the foundation of everything that I said. Everything that I said was predicated upon this possibility that a democracy allows for popular mobilization around issues which have been neglected. And I believe water and farming are the central issues of our time. Already you can see the farmers' agitation, and actually water conflicts are the dominant form of conflicts in our country today. What we need is for they to become the locus of mobilization, so that there is more and more pressure put on governments to try and change the way they have governed water. And I think that possibility exists. It exists because, as I said, the state has to legitimize its power. It exerts its power in the name of the people. And so it has to listen to the voice of those people. That is the hope. That is the strategy on which all of the propositions that I have made in my presentation are based. And let me add, that is the direction in which, if you notice, governments at the center and in the states are already moving. In the last 10 years, what we are seeing is a movement in the direction that are outlined in my lecture. It can be said democracy faces many challenges, but the only answer to that is deepening of democracy. And I think without understanding that weaknesses of democracy can be only corrected by deepening democracy, we will neither understand water, nor farming, nor democracy itself. And I think that is the answer to all the skepticism that exists around democracy. If we try and say that an authoritarian solution will work, I think there could not be a bigger mistake to be made about any of India's problems. This is what I would strongly urge all of you to recognize, appreciate, and push the envelope forward in strengthening democracy in India. All the young people of this country have a central role to play in making that happen.
Thank you so much, Mihir. I think we've passed time. We have overflowed. But thank you so much for your talk and for the discussions. There's one participant who very firmly says there is no democracy left in current India to end. And so I think we have an ongoing discussion here where we have to, keep engaging and deepening our understanding, but we're out of time. It's been my privilege to learn from you, from your writings and from your work over the last many years. And it's just been a wonderful privilege to hear you today as well. I'll hand over to Buddhaditya, our third co-conspirator in the series, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mekhla. It is truly my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks for the second lecture in the Masterclass series. It's thank you, first of all, Professor Mihir Shah, for delivering a truly paradigm-shifting talk. And I think I'm saying for a lot of people who heard this on Zoom and on YouTube, that I'm feeling rejuvenated after listening to you. It was truly astounding to see how you brought together everything from the to the best available scientific evidence to community media projects, and of course 30 years of experience and wisdom to this talk of 50 minutes. And as I was listening to you, I felt that this is a masterclass, and when the students when they become scholars, practitioners, researchers in their own right, and I include myself as a student, and when we encounter these real world challenges of democracy, of pragmatism, of conflict and vested interests, I think this talk today gives us the values and the vision that may help us to resolve some of those moral and political dilemmas. For that, I thank you. I also thank you for encouraging so many angry women and men towards productive and alternative possibilities and future. Thank you so much for a very, very fascinating talk. I would like to thank Dr. Suresh Babu, Dean, School of Human Ecology, for always encouraging and supporting us in our endeavors, and for facilitating the masterclass series. Thank you, Dr. Mekla Krishnamurthy, for being the chair and the moderator for today's discussion, for extending the discussion and conversation with Dr. Shah. As you know, Professor, Dr. Krishnamurthy has also co-curated the masterclass. Thank you, Professor Asmita Kabra, for being, as was said, a co-conspirator in for this idea of the masterclass series, and also for teaching the agrarian change and rural development elective at the School of Human Ecology, where students get to discuss many of these issues, and where the idea for the masterclass was hatched. I would like to thank all our audience for being such a wonderful audience. I think we had some really important and great questions to which we don't. I don't think we had the answers to all of them, but they were wonderful to sort of hear them. The master's students and PhD scholars at the School of Human Ecology are an important resource for us. They're volunteers for the series, and they help us organize the series. So thank you to them. The IT services division of Ambedkar University always helps us with logistics and technical aspects of the presentation. So they deserve our grateful thank you. I thank you finally, Fizala Taibullah, researcher at the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability at Ambedkar University, for designing beautiful posters for the masterclass series. Thank you, everyone. As Professor Kabra mentioned in the chat box, our next third lecture in the masterclass series is on next Wednesday, in fact, 25th of November, where Professor Mukulika Banerjee of the London School of Economics will speak on democracy. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, for being a part of the series.
Thank you.